Good afternoon. Actually, I wanted to thank John from Berkeley because you have helped me perfect my intellectual growth with an identity of American higher education. I originally tried to apply to Berkeley when I decided to go to graduate school. I was declined, but then Stanford offered me a place. So you have helped me perfect my intellectual growth in the best of both worlds between the two sides of the bay. Okay, today, instead of talking very macro processes of China, I wanted just to offer a very brief set of remarks addressing in particular how higher education has been a site for redefining the boundaries of the nation, and how higher education also has been the site for negotiating the relationship between the individual and the national collective. In doing so, I shall take the case of some of the recent changes and organizations of Hong Kong's university institutions in an attempt to also appropriate what these meanings are. What are all these meanings of changes within the context of China as now our sovereign nation? But at the same time, you will see that it's also generating, in my discussion, it's also generating many what I call decoupled consequences in channeling down an effective set of norms and standardized practices as expected typically from a nation or a strong state mechanism. So let me just say a few words very quickly to give you a brief overview of Hong Kong, the setting, the context. As you all know, in 1997, Hong Kong was handed back to China. The handover was smooth, in a way successful, under the one country, two systems. Everything will be remained unchanged for 50 years until 2047. So we have actually walked past 20 years. Now, I will put it in two phrases. In the first phrase of this, after this handover, I would call it, there's a lot of what we call the logic of confidence was in place. Referring to, at that point, China's legitimate rules and governance was totally rested upon a sovereign nation. As you all see, typically appropriated and realized and emphasized by the Chinese government in diplomacy, in international relations, and in water politics, now in the South China Sea. So the confidence, the logic of confidence is now that Hong Kong is back to China, the sovereignty is there. So it's like a fostered son now returned back to the real parents. So China was very confident at that point. Now for Hong Kong, many of us at that point had yet to catch the essence of ruled and governed with autonomy. People there have been for too long time living under the idea of borrowed time, borrowed place for 155 years as a British colony before. What happened in university at that point after the handover? It was a period of anticipated, very gradual integration. Some talked about 50 years, 70 years, or even longer. But with a very clear division of labor, operating everything in a more coherent way. In form and in structure, the higher education, beginning from 1997, has expanded immensely, widening access, particularly in higher education, for high school students to enter higher education. And at the same time, also switching to what I call a global standardized model of a 4-year university undergraduate education. So before that, it was 3 years, typically after a British model. Now, when the debate was on about why 4 years, that's too much like a Chinese one, because Chinese universities have always been on a 4-year. So is that an American model? Because American has always, higher education has always been on a 4-year model. So debates were on very petty things like, you know, who were we after? Which model? Which exemplary model? But at the end, nobody wanted to talk about it as if we model after or aligned with the nation. So we were not following China nor the US model. Instead, we were talking more about Hong Kong is an international financial center, cosmopolitan, and should always go alongside with universal attributes and norms. So, in that period of time, except for some very special and meticulous attention must be given to, for example, how to address the nation properly. I give you an example. In the university strategic plan, internationalization was a big word and still is. We would call it a university internationalization strategic plan, but we will call it a China engagement plan, not an internationalization plan, not part of it. In admitting lots of mainland Chinese students to the university, they cannot be categorized as international students or foreign students, although they pay the same tuition fees as international students. We call them non-local mainland students, differentiating them from the foreign or international category. So there was very little distinct control over university governance at that time. Soft power values such as academic freedom, civil liberties, was only sporadic concerns raised by the more radical academic Democrats in Hong Kong. But in general, the nation was understood by many of us, especially by the intellectual class, as a separate entity politically, if not only culturally, in the sense of the Chinese-ness. Otherwise, what else? Nothing more, nothing less. There was, at that point, there was an longitudinal survey in 2008. We reached the peak of how national identity was being expressed by Hong Kong people. In 2008, 42% of Hong Kong young people between the age of 18 to 30, we would call ourselves Chinese at that point. Emigration of intellectuals or academics dropped to a record low. Many, in fact, returned from overseas after they got their PhDs to Hong Kong to seek university faculty positions. It's very interesting also to also specify academic freedom, freedom of speech. They were more or less understood as individual freedom, individual rights. securing individuality. So not much discussion on academic freedoms, freedom of speech at that point. Now, the second phase, the big turnaround came in 2012 when the Hong Kong SAR government, we call it the Special Administrative Region, when the Hong Kong SAR government announced national education would be introduced to both primary and secondary school as an independent subject in the school curriculum. They would also need to study that in order to gain admission to the university. There was an uproar of student protests, demonstrations, high school students went out on the streets, university students went out on the streets, protesting against this. This was an indoctrination of not nation, but indoctrination of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. There were discussions then about choices, about individual rights versus also what is it meant to be part of the nation or part of the collective. At the end, the movement was so severe that the Hong Kong government had to leave aside the introduction of national education into the curriculum. So after 2012, after that second phase, it's sort of a soft awakening of the Chinese government that conventional nationalism could not be dealt in such a way. So at the same time, what did university do? University after 2012 also make a big turnaround. Universities then had much closer contact with the Chinese government. Universities then were advised by the Chinese Ministry of Education to teach more the law and order, the basic law. Basically, it's a mini constitution of Hong Kong under the national constitution law of the People's Republic of China. China began to relax on the admission of Hong Kong students to enroll in mainland top universities. For example, our Hong Kong secondary school graduates could seek admissions to Peking University or Tsinghua University without being examined by any of the national examination body. There were more visits from mainland senior level of officials, more exchange of meetings, more emphasis now on the one country and less on the two systems. Interestingly, Hong Kong University, the universities in Hong Kong, we have no private university. There are 8 universities in Hong Kong, and they are 100% public universities. Emphasize on the necessity to subscribe to global norms and global practices. So there's then a total redistribution of resources to state very clearly the changing expectations of the academics. More research, less important on teaching, even less important on services. Very aggressive move to recruit foreign and international faculties to the universities in Hong Kong. Fashioning the curriculum by incorporating more instructions on social inclusiveness. For example, we study the history of women, history of children, workers, and all of those. Increasing large amount of scholarships to attract foreign students to come to study in Hong Kong. There's a burgeoning of student-centered and civic discussions on human rights. Lots of reforms were directed to critical thinking through the high school curriculum on the subject called liberal studies instead of national education. Heavy emphasis on intellectual property, knowledge transfer, etc., etc. Time?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just close my talk here by just to tell you in very, very recently, there has been very extreme, radical student movement or even a wider public movement in now abandoning the nation and constructing what we call now a local, autonomous, and independent Hong Kong that really has touched the baseline of the Chinese government as a sovereign nation. So the tension was there. Maybe I can discuss about the issues later on in the forum. Thank you.
All right.